The wind howled across the Bavarian countryside on that final evening of March 1922, carrying with it the scent of impending doom. Hinterkaifeck farm stood like a weathered sentinel against the darkening sky, its wooden walls groaning under the weight of secrets that would soon spill forth in blood. Andreas Gruber stepped out of his farmhouse and surveyed his property with the practiced eye of a man who had worked this land for decades. At 63, he was a robust figure, his weathered hands testament to years of hard labor. The farm sat isolated, nearly 4 miles from the nearest village of Kaifeck, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to press closer with each passing year. Something was wrong. Andreas had felt it for days now, a creeping unease that settled in his bones like the damp Bavarian cold. It wasn't just the strange sounds he'd been hearing at night, or the footprints he'd discovered in the snow leading from the forest to his barn and then disappearing. No, it was something deeper, more primitive, the kind of fear that had kept his ancestors alive through countless dark nights in these ancient woods. His wife Kazilia emerged from the house, her 72-year-old frame wrapped in a heavy shawl. "The animals are restless tonight," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Maria thinks someone's been in the barn again." Maria Baumgartner, their 44-year-old daughter, had returned to the farm 6 years earlier after her husband's death in the Great War, bringing with her 2 children, 7-year-old Kazilia and 2-year-old Joseph. The family had closed ranks around their grief, becoming even more insular, more suspicious of outsiders. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the darkness seemed alive. 3 days earlier, Andreas had made a discovery that chilled him to his core. While checking on his livestock, he'd noticed strange footprints in the snow, footprints that led from the dark line of the forest directly to his barn. The tracks were fresh, made sometime during the night, and they belonged to someone wearing heavy boots. What terrified Andreas wasn't just the presence of a trespasser. It was where the tracks ended. They simply stopped at the barn door, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished. No tracks leading away. No sign of departure. Just the eerie suggestion that someone had walked to his barn and somehow disappeared into thin air. He'd searched the barn thoroughly, his heart pounding as he moved through the familiar space that now felt foreign and threatening. The hay was disturbed in places, as if someone had been sleeping there. A few tools were out of place. But whoever had been there was gone, or so he hoped. The maid, Victoria Gabriel, had quit abruptly just days before. She'd worked for the Gruber family for several months, but one morning she'd appeared at breakfast white-faced and trembling, announcing she could no longer stay. When pressed for a reason, she'd only whispered about strange sounds and voices in the walls. Andreas had dismissed her concerns as feminine hysteria, but now, standing in his barn with evidence of an intruder, her words echoed ominously in his mind. That same evening, young Kazilia had come running into the house, tears streaming down her face. She claimed to have seen a face at her bedroom window, a pale, gaunt face that had watched her with hollow eyes before disappearing into the night. Her grandfather had checked outside but found nothing, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being observed from the darkness beyond. The newspaper had stopped arriving. Their mail had been tampered with, letters opened and resealed clumsily, as if someone was monitoring their correspondence. Andreas had mentioned these concerns to his neighbors in Kaifeck, but they'd responded with the typical rural mixture of skepticism and dark humor. "Probably just some vagrant looking for shelter," they'd said. "These are hard times." But Andreas knew better. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Someone was watching them, studying them, preparing for something terrible. Friday, March 31, 1922, dawned gray and oppressive. The clouds hung low over Hinterkaifeck, casting everything in a perpetual twilight that seemed to drain the color from the world. Andreas went about his morning chores with mechanical precision, but his mind was elsewhere, consumed by a growing sense of dread. The new maid was supposed to arrive that day. Maria Baumgartner, not to be confused with his daughter of the same name, had been hired to replace Victoria Gabriel. She was expected on the afternoon train from Munich, and someone would need to meet her at the station in Schrobenhausen. But as the day wore on, a strange lethargy seemed to settle over the farm. Conversations became muted, movements sluggish. Even the children seemed affected, playing quietly instead of with their usual boisterous energy. The animals, too, appeared nervous, the cattle lowing anxiously, the chickens refusing to venture far from their coop. At dinner, the family gathered around their heavy wooden table as they had countless times before. The meal was simple but hearty: bread, sausage, and vegetables from their cellar. but the food seemed to turn to ash in their mouths. Even 2-year-old Joseph, usually chattering constantly, ate in silence. Andreas kept glancing toward the windows, though the gathering darkness outside revealed nothing. The wind had picked up again, rattling the shutters and sending tree branches scraping against the roof like skeletal fingers. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow deeper and more threatening. "Perhaps we should go to bed early tonight," Kazilia suggested, her voice strained with an anxiety she couldn't quite name. They retired to their rooms as the clock struck 9, but sleep would not come easily to any of them. The house settled around them with unusual creaks and groans, as if the very walls were shifting in anticipation of what was to come. What none of them knew was that their stalker had been closer than they'd ever imagined. For days, perhaps weeks, someone had been living in their attic space above the barn, watching their routines, learning their habits, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The first blow fell in the barn. Andreas had gone out for his evening check on the animals, a routine he'd followed faithfully for decades. The barn was warm and dark, filled with the familiar sounds and smells of livestock. He'd just begun to relax, thinking perhaps his fears had been unfounded, when he heard a soft sound behind him, the whisper of a footstep on straw. He turned, and in the dim lantern light, he saw a figure emerging from the shadows. For a brief moment, Andreas might have felt relief. Surely this was just some vagrant, someone he could reason with, perhaps even help. But then he saw the pickaxe. The weapon descended with brutal efficiency, the sharp point penetrating his skull with a wet, sickening sound. Andreas Gruber, patriarch of Hinterkaifeck, crumpled to the barn floor, his blood seeping into the straw where his cattle watched with wide, frightened eyes. The killer worked quickly now, driven by a terrible purpose. Kazilia appeared at the barn door, calling for her husband. "Andreas? Is everything all right?" Her voice carried the note of concern that had been building all week, the intuitive fear of a woman who sensed danger even when she couldn't see it. She stepped into the barn, and the pickaxe found her too. At 72, she had no chance to defend herself, no opportunity to cry out. The weapon crushed her skull, and she fell beside her husband, their blood mingling in the straw. Maria came next, drawn by some instinct that something was terribly wrong. Perhaps she heard a sound, or maybe it was simply the mother's intuition that her children were in danger. She called out as she approached the barn, her voice echoing across the farmyard. The killer was waiting. The attack was swift and brutal. Maria Baumgartner, widow and mother, joined her parents in death, her body adding to the growing pile of corpses in the barn. 3 generations of the Gruber family lay murdered, their blood slowly pooling on the barn floor. But the killer wasn't finished. 7-year-old Kazilia had been sleeping in her bed when the sounds from the barn finally penetrated her dreams. Children possess an acute sensitivity to danger that adults often lose, and something in the quality of the silence that followed the distant noises filled her with terror. She crept from her bed and peered out her window toward the barn. In the moonlight, she could see a figure moving back and forth, dragging something heavy. Even at her young age, she understood instinctively that whatever was happening was wrong, terribly, horribly wrong. The child tried to wake her baby brother, but 2-year-old Joseph was deep in the profound sleep of infancy. Kazilia huddled by his crib, paralyzed with fear, as footsteps approached the house. The killer entered through the kitchen door, which the family had left unlocked, a common practice in rural Bavaria, where neighbors trusted neighbors and crime was rare. The wooden floors creaked under the intruder's weight as they moved through the familiar rooms, navigating by moonlight and perhaps by previous reconnaissance. Young Kazilia's terror reached new heights as she heard the footsteps coming up the stairs. She pulled the blankets over her head, the childish belief that if she couldn't see the danger, it couldn't see her. But there would be no hiding from what came next. The bedroom door opened slowly, revealing a dark silhouette against the hallway's dim light. The killer approached the bed where the 2 children lay, the pickaxe still dripping with the blood of their family. The attack was mercifully quick. Little Kazilia, named for her grandmother who now lay dead in the barn, was struck down in her bed. The blow was so violent it penetrated completely through her skull. Baby Joseph, still sleeping peacefully, never woke from his final slumber. What happened next would confound investigators for decades and add an element of psychological horror to an already unspeakable crime. The killer didn't flee immediately. Instead, they remained at Hinterkaifeck for days, living among the corpses like some ghoulish inhabitant of a charnel house. The evidence would later show that someone had fed the livestock, eaten food from the kitchen, and even lit fires in the fireplace. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney for days after the murders, assuming the family was simply going about their normal routine. The killer had covered the bodies in the barn with hay and straw, hiding them from immediate view. In the house, the children's bodies were arranged more carefully, almost tenderly, and covered with bedsheets. This attention to the victims suggested either remorse or a deeply disturbed mind that couldn't fully comprehend the magnitude of the crime. On April 4, 1922, Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, arrived at Hinterkaifeck as planned. She found the farmhouse eerily quiet, with no one responding to her calls. The animals were lowing desperately in the barn, clearly distressed and hungry despite evidence that they'd been fed recently. Growing concerned, Maria ventured into the barn to investigate. What she discovered there would haunt her for the rest of her life. The bodies of Andreas, Kazilia, and Maria Gruber lay beneath a covering of hay, their skulls crushed by repeated blows from a sharp instrument. The maid's screams echoed across the empty farmyard as she ran toward the house, hoping against hope that the children might have survived. But the silence that greeted her was answer enough. In their bedroom, she found little Kazilia and baby Joseph, their small bodies bearing the same terrible wounds as their elders. News of the Hinterkaifeck murders spread through Bavaria like wildfire, shocking a rural community that had never experienced such brutal violence. The local constabulary was ill-equipped to handle a crime of this magnitude, and within days, investigators from Munich arrived to take charge of the case. What they found defied easy explanation. The crime scene suggested a killer who was both coldly calculating and deeply disturbed. The attacks had been carried out with methodical precision, each victim struck down with multiple blows from what appeared to be a mattock or pickaxe. The weapon was never found, despite extensive searches of the property and surrounding forest. The evidence of the killer's extended stay at the farm was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the case. Investigators discovered that someone had been living in the house for at least 3 days after the murders, sleeping in the beds, eating the family's food, and maintaining the property as if nothing had happened. In the kitchen, they found evidence of recently prepared meals. The fireplace showed signs of recent use. Most disturbing of all, the killer had apparently continued to care for the livestock, feeding and watering the animals that had witnessed their owners' brutal deaths. Neighbors reported seeing lights in the farmhouse windows for several nights after what they now knew were the murders. Some had even observed a figure moving about the property, assuming it was one of the family members. The killer had successfully maintained the illusion of normalcy while living among their victims' corpses. Theories and suspects. As the investigation progressed, numerous theories emerged about who might have committed such a heinous crime. The isolated nature of the farm and the killer's apparent familiarity with the property suggested someone who knew the family well. The first suspect was Lawrence Schlittenbauer, a neighboring farmer who had been having an affair with Maria Baumgartner. Some believed he was the father of her youngest child, Joseph, and might have killed the family in a fit of rage or to prevent exposure of their relationship. Schlittenbauer had been among the first to arrive at the scene after the bodies were discovered, and some witnesses claimed he seemed unusually calm for someone confronting such carnage. However, Schlittenbauer had alibis for the time of the murders, and there was no concrete evidence linking him to the crime beyond speculation about his relationship with Maria. Another theory focused on a mysterious stranger who had been seen in the area in the days leading up to the murders. Several witnesses reported encounters with a vagrant or itinerant worker who had been asking about employment at local farms. This man was described as tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into whoever he spoke with. The description matched young Kazilia's account of the face she'd seen at her window, lending credence to the theory that the family had been stalked by a dangerous drifter. However, despite extensive efforts, this mysterious stranger was never identified or located. Some investigators theorized that the killer might have been a disturbed war veteran, perhaps suffering from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The Great War had ended just 4 years earlier, leaving countless soldiers psychologically damaged and struggling to readjust to civilian life. The methodical nature of the attacks and the killer's ability to remain calm while living among corpses suggested someone who had become desensitized to violence and death. Almost immediately after the discovery of the bodies, locals began reporting strange phenomena at Hinterkaifeck. The farm, already isolated and foreboding, took on an aura of genuine menace that seemed to affect even skeptical investigators. Workers hired to clean up the crime scene reported hearing voices in empty rooms, footsteps in the attic, and doors that opened and closed by themselves. Several men quit after just a few hours, claiming the atmosphere in the house was unbearable and evil. Animals refused to enter certain areas of the property, particularly the barn where the first 3 victims had been found. Horses would rear and bolt when led near the building, and dogs would whine and cower rather than investigate the structure where they had once played freely. Local clergy were called in to bless the property, but even they reported feeling an oppressive presence that seemed to resist their efforts. Father Heinrich Müller, who had known the Gruber family for years, later wrote that he had never encountered such a palpable sense of evil in all his years of ministry. These reports weren't limited to the immediate aftermath of the murders. For decades afterward, people claimed to see lights moving through the abandoned farmhouse at night, to hear the sounds of children crying, and to glimpse shadowy figures moving through the rooms where the family had died. Whether these phenomena were real or simply the product of traumatized minds trying to process an incomprehensible tragedy, they added another layer of horror to an already nightmarish story. The demolition and legacy. In 1923, less than a year after the murders, the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse was demolished. The decision was made partly for practical reasons. The property couldn't be sold with its grim history, but also because the building had become a magnet for curiosity seekers and amateur investigators who disturbed the peace of the surrounding community. The demolition itself was not without incident. Workers reported that the building seemed to resist their efforts, with beams falling unexpectedly and tools breaking at crucial moments. Several men were injured during the process, leading to whispers that the house itself was cursed. The land where Hinterkaifeck once stood remained empty for years, avoided by locals who crossed themselves when passing the site. Eventually, the forest began to reclaim the cleared ground, and today, few physical traces remain of the farm where 6 people met their brutal end. However, the case refused to die. Over the decades, numerous investigators, both professional and amateur, have attempted to solve the mystery of who killed the Gruber family. Each new theory brings fresh attention to the case, but none has provided the definitive answer that might finally lay the victims to rest. In recent years, advanced forensic techniques have been applied to the evidence from Hinterkaifeck, hoping that modern science might succeed where traditional detective work had failed. Computer modeling has been used to analyze the crime scene, and DNA testing has been attempted on preserved evidence. These efforts have yielded some interesting insights but no breakthrough. The brutality and precision of the attacks suggest someone with knowledge of anatomy or experience with violence. The killer's behavior after the murders indicates a profound psychological disturbance, possibly including dissociative episodes or a complete break from reality. Profilers have suggested that the perpetrator might have been someone who felt wronged by the family, possibly a dismissed employee or rejected suitor. The extended stay at the farm after the murders could indicate either a desperate attempt to delay discovery or a delusional belief that the killer could somehow assume the family's life. Despite these modern approaches, the case remains officially unsolved. The Munich Police Department still maintains an active file on the Hinterkaifeck murders, though few expect new evidence to emerge after more than a century. What makes the Hinterkaifeck murders so compelling isn't just their brutality, but their seeming impossibility. How could 6 people be killed in such an isolated location without anyone hearing their cries for help? How could the killer remain on the property for days without being discovered? And perhaps most disturbing of all, how could someone commit such an act of evil and then simply vanish into history? The case has inspired countless books, documentaries, and fictional adaptations, each attempting to make sense of the senseless. Some focus on the investigative aspects, treating it as a puzzle to be solved through logic and deduction. Others emphasize the supernatural elements, suggesting that some crimes are so heinous they leave permanent scars on the very fabric of reality. But perhaps the most honest approach is to acknowledge that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, not because the truth is unknowable, but because the truth is too terrible to comprehend. The Hinterkaifeck murders represent a glimpse into the darkest corners of human nature, a reminder that evil exists in forms so pure and undiluted that they defy rational explanation. In focusing on the mystery and horror of their deaths, it's important not to forget that the victims of Hinterkaifeck were real people with real lives, hopes, and dreams. Andreas Gruber was a hard-working farmer who had spent his life building something lasting for his family. Kazilia was a grandmother who had lived through decades of change and challenge. Maria was a young widow struggling to raise her children alone in difficult times. 7-year-old Kazilia was just beginning to discover the world, full of curiosity and wonder that would never be satisfied. Baby Joseph had barely begun to live, his potential snuffed out before he could take his first steps or speak his first words. These weren't just statistics in a crime report or characters in a sensational story. They were human beings whose lives were cut short in the most brutal way imaginable. Their tragedy echoes across the decades, a reminder of how quickly ordinary life can be transformed into nightmare. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, who discovered the bodies, never fully recovered from her traumatic experience. She left Bavaria shortly after giving her testimony and spent the rest of her life haunted by what she had seen in that blood-soaked barn. More than a century has passed since that terrible night in March 1922, but the darkness that descended on Hinterkaifeck seems undiminished by time. The case remains one of Germany's most notorious unsolved crimes, a puzzle that has defied every attempt at solution. Perhaps that's as it should be. Some evils are so profound that they resist easy explanation or comfortable resolution. The Hinterkaifeck murders serve as a reminder that monsters are real, that they walk among us wearing human faces, and that sometimes the only thing standing between ordinary people and unspeakable horror is luck and circumstance. The forest where the farm once stood continues to grow, its trees reaching toward a sky that once witnessed unimaginable terror. Animals still avoid certain areas, and sensitive individuals report feeling watched when passing through the region. Whether these phenomena have any basis in reality or exist only in the collective unconscious of a traumatized community is impossible to say. What we do know is that 6 innocent people died horribly at Hinterkaifeck, and their killer escaped justice. Somewhere in the records of history, the truth lies waiting to be discovered. But until that day comes, if it ever does, the murders at Hinterkaifeck will remain what they have always been, a testament to the capacity for evil that lurks in the human heart, and a reminder that some nightmares are all too real. The wind still howls across the Bavarian countryside on cold March nights, carrying with it the echoes of screams that were silenced a century ago. And in the darkness between the trees, something watches and waits, keeping the terrible secrets of Hinterkaifeck locked away in shadows that grow deeper with each passing year. In the end, perhaps the most frightening aspect of the Hinterkaifeck murders isn't that they happened, but that they could happen again. Evil doesn't die with time, it only waits for another opportunity, another isolated farm, another family sleeping peacefully in the belief that tomorrow will be just another ordinary day. But sometimes, tomorrow never comes at all.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like and subscribe button, and then share it with your friends. Your support helps us grow and create even more awesome content. We appreciate you being part of the journey.